Alright, good morning. Today we're doing a cylinder head gasket replacement on a Kia Sportage 2011 with a 2.4 liter. We're going to take it slow because many of you students have never taken an engine apart. Some of you have. We're going to go ahead by taking some of the accessories off, gain access to the battery. Now these clips, although they have a Phillips head on them, they are a plastic rivet. And after one application, the threads are pretty shot. So if you just use a hook tool and then a trim tool to get underneath of it, you can bring it far enough up to extract the plastic rivet. Okay? You want to disconnect the negative terminal first, always. Okay. Push that out of the way so that it can't come in contact with the post again. Okay, then remove your positive. And then you're going to remove your battery from your battery tray. And then remove and stow your battery out of your way. Just move that off camera. Okay. Get in a practice of keeping your tools and equipment on a nearby workbench. Don't clutter your work area. Another thing too that I want to share with young technicians, you all have cell phones these days, and utilize the camera on it. So if you're ready to remove a harness, and take some photographs that you can refer back to at a later date. So anywhere you're taking connections apart and you're looking at harnesses, by all means, and then go through your images to make sure that you captured clearly what it is that you want to identify before you remove the harness fully. So I'm going to follow this harness down, take a picture of the back of the head, and see that it ties into the cam sensor there. Okay, take your time, young technicians. Learn your fasteners. You have a push tab on both sides. Basically what you're doing is you're taking your trim tool, you're getting underneath, you're finding that tab, and you're pushing it, releasing it. On both sides. And then you're pulling it out. Do not break them. Your customers, you know, they don't want their car back with a bunch of broken parts on it. Please try to remember, if you're having a hard time releasing a connector, push the connector together, then press the tab, hear the click, and remove it. Okay, now, unfortunately, whoever worked on this in the past, the tab on the purge solenoid is broken. So you have to get in with a screwdriver and very carefully lift what's remaining of the hold down tab. It appears that the technician that broke the tab used ultra gray silicone to hold the connector together. So getting it undone is proving extremely problematic. Invest in a good Cobb LED light. You have the ability to use it as a flashlight or slide it open. It is also magnetic. Okay, so you can position it to give you light where you need it. You're going to spend about $15 to $18 for something like this, but trust me, it's well worth the investment. Okay, before we can remove anything else, I have to drain the coolant. I'm ready to pull the intake manifold off, but I have a heated throttle body, so I need to get the coolant, what's remaining of the coolant, out of the system. Okay. For about $80, $90 online, you can get an extraction pump, and it comes with 3 different diameter hoses. And you want to go ahead and there's a foot pedal that you pull out, and you can pump and extract the coolant from the system. After you pump it about 20 times, it creates a reserve of vacuum in the tank, and it'll continue to draw liquid. Some shops will have one of these for petroleum fluids like trans fluid and oil, and one for coolants. When using them for coolants, please rinse them out thoroughly when you're done, because cross-contamination between coolant types is possible. Some coolants don't mix well with others and can cause a gelling effect. As you can see in here, I'm getting down to the bottom level of the radiator. That doesn't mean that my block is empty. It just means that my radiator is empty. Now, you can take the lower hose, take your upper hose, and push that fluid, like by raising it up, we can get the fluid into the radiator, at which time we can now remove the upper hose using our clamp tool. And all we're going to do with this is we're going to push it off to the side so that it's out of our field of work. if need be, piece of mechanics wire, a zip tie. Mechanics wire is a non-coated steel wire. You can get this at most parts stores, Tractor Supply, or online. Now, do not use a wire cutter for electrical wire on steel. Your slip jaw pliers, most manufacturers have a cutter at the base of the jaw. If you bring the pliers to their smallest opening and position it on the steel wire, it'll cut the wire. But if you cut it with an electrical connector cutter, you'll actually damage the cutting surfaces, and then when you go to cut copper, it will not cut completely. Mechanics wire can be used over and over again. That's what's nice about it versus a zip tie or a cable tie. Most technicians will fold it in half and hang it off of the handle of their toolbox so that it's readily available when you need something. What I'm doing, if you can see the camera angle, I'm moving the clamps back. And just like we did previously, we're getting our tool underneath, giving it a little silicone lubricant, working the tool around the pipe nipple. And then wiggle the hose off. You may have a de minimis release of coolant that may be laying in the hose. This next pipe I'm going to need to finish unbolting the throttle plate to get it off of its pipe. And make sure that I don't drop any of my bolts. Okay. As you can see, the throttle plate has a large amount of carbon buildup around it, which will cause the vehicle to idle poorly. This vehicle has around 100,000 miles, and this is common. This should be removed and cleaned with throttle body cleaner about every 60,000 miles. The base opening around the throttle plate is engineered into the idle management system and the programming of the PCM to allow a metered amount of air past the throttle plate. When it clogs, especially with these motorized drive-by-wire actuator throttle bodies, it has to constantly flutter and open the throttle plate to maintain idle, especially under load when the air conditioning's on, or you have the alternator, you know, running a high load, you know, your high beams are on, it's nighttime, you're driving with the wipers on, the blower's on high for the defrost. You know, if the car is idling at a traffic light, it has to constantly fluctuate. So, you know, keep it clean if it's your own car. Get in the habit of doing it. I do it more frequently, around 30,000-40,000 miles. You know, it takes an hour, but it's time well spent to have a car that idles well under all conditions. So now we're getting closer to our ability to remove our intake manifold. We're going to let our harness drop and tuck out of the way, and then concentrate on what's still left. As you can see, we have 2 coolant pipes, and then we have a fuel line. Now the fuel is going to be under pressure. As a technician, you should have, you know, shop rags or old t-shirts, whatever the case may be. And you want to go ahead and put some type of rag around the fitting so that when the fuel pressure starts to leak out, the O-ring is holding it in. Okay, so as you can see, our rag is gathering up our fuel. And we're going to tuck our hose up and out of the way for right now. Expect some dripping. And thread your nuts back onto your fuel rail. Okay. Now I misspoke earlier. These are not coolant pipes. These are actually from the fuel tank. These are our purge lines. Now, all right, we're going to take a minute and get a magnet. Two things. Always stop and recover your hardware. You never want to, you know, leave it to where it can fall into somewhere. And sometimes, you know, something very critical, you're working on an open engine, you don't want a fastener falling somewhere in a crevice that will then get ingested into the engine and cause catastrophic damage. So keep that in mind. Now, because this bracket that I just unbolted had both a nut and a washer, take and thread them together and put it in your tray so that you know that when you go to reassemble, this bolt is specific and nut to this bracket. So as we start to peel away the proverbial layers of parts, we can start to see what we can and cannot unbolt. So now the intake manifold is held with a series of nuts and bolts. So we're going to use our magnet because we can't get our hands in there. And as the nut clears the stud, our magnet is there to grab it. Now this next bolt, the sheer size of our ratchet and extension can't fit on it. We're going to use a 1/4 inch drive. Our extension is a little bit too long, so we'll go to a shorter extension. Go ahead and break it free before you engage the air, especially when taking a larger bolt off with a 1/4 inch air ratchet. Now the PCV hose, which is attached to the manifold, prohibits the bolt from coming all the way out. So that is going to have to stay there for now. And that is not long enough. Now our nut is down inside that plastic tube, so we're going to go in after it. It's actually a bolt, and pull it out. Now, as young technicians, you're going to come across things that you've never done. And until you have years of experience, you're going to make mistakes. Try to learn from the mistakes. When something goes wrong, take a moment, collect your thoughts, and try to understand what you could have done differently to prevent it from happening. We're going to take a pause because I have to get some jacks out and some jack stands, and I have to loosen or remove a bolt on the bottom of the intake manifold, which is attached to the block. Okay, let's take a look. We're underneath the vehicle now, and as you can see, there's a bracket at the base of the intake manifold with two 12mm fasteners. All right, we're using a 12mm universal socket. This is not a universal joint and a socket. This is incorporated into one. And this is going to give us the ability to get into this obscure angle. Okay. And if you give me a second, I'll get the air ratchet. And always remember, break it free first, then hit the air. All right, so we want to bring our fastener out of our opening. And as you can see now, the bolts are out of the manifold. And we'll move back to the top. All right, the next step, we've removed the wheel and we're going to go ahead and support the chassis. Please, when jacking up on an oil pan, use a wooden block or a rubber pad. That's to not dent the oil pan. As you can see, there's some rust on these. We're going to go ahead and put a little lubricant on those. Okay, so we have the bracket removed. Next step is the removal of the serpentine belt, and then any accessory bracket that is preventing us from getting the timing cover off. Okay. Now, before we remove the serpentine belt, we want to get in and loosen the bolts on the water pump pulley, because once the belt's off, we won't be able to remove those because the pulley will just want to spin. We can get the proper tool now to remove the belt. Okay, the next tool I want to introduce you to is a serpentine belt master set. This tool will work on any vehicle, whether you have a square drive tensioner or a tensioner that has a hex nut. All right, the tool is three layers. All right, so this tensioner we want to pull towards the firewall. So we want to position the wrench so that it grabs going towards the firewall. The size is 17 millimeters. You'll notice that the socket is hollow, all right, to allow a stud to come through. And then we have the handle, which locks onto the opposing side. So now we're going to go down, and before removing the serpentine belt, take a photograph of it, draw a diagram so that you know how it goes back together. Okay, so now this allows us to push the tensioner, releasing the pressure. And we can take the serpentine belt off of its pulleys and then bring the tool back to its rest position. remove it. And then socket's still on the tensioner. Stow it back in its box. You won't be using this again until we reassemble. You can buy this online for about $80 to $100 depending upon brand. Please understand that you can buy a Snap-on or a Mac or a Matco, and you know, you'll pay a little bit more for a professional grade tool, but this, I'm trying to show you tools that a young technician can go buy that's affordable. So you'll notice that most of my tools are brand name, Snap-on or Mac, but specialty tools like this that will do a job for 1/4 the cost, I try to buy them and experiment with them and see how good they are, and then recommend them to my students. Okay? So the next step is to pull the serpentine belt completely off all the accessory pulleys. So we got them off the top, and then we'll go below. We'll take them off the AC compressor, the idler, and then the crankshaft. Now, as we can see, this belt is in need of replacement. When we reassemble, we'll be putting a new serpentine belt. You'll notice that the grooves are shiny and glazy, and the webs are cracked due to friction and use. So this belt is at its end of life. Now this is a Dayco belt, so this has been replaced at least once in the 100,000 miles that the vehicle has been in service. Serpentine belts should be inspected every 4 years or 50,000 miles and replaced mandatorily at least every 90,000 or sooner if they show signs of wear. So next, we're going to try to start taking accessory brackets off. To do that, to give a little room for our tools, we're going to go ahead and choose the right socket length to get our brackets off. Now the reason I'm using a standard non-air ratchet is I don't have a lot of room between the frame rail and the front of this engine assembly. There's a removable plug in the frame rail that will give us access to that bolt that I was just struggling with. Appears to be quite long. We're going to move back up to the top. I'm raising the engine up just a little bit so I can get to this one idler pulley. Okay, so now with the upper idler pulley removed, I'm able to get to my last bolt on my engine bracket. Now this I will be able to use an air ratchet for because of the depth that I have. Okay, I need a shallow. And still having a little difficulty. So we're going to bring the engine up just a few more degrees of angle. Okay. We have available to us, your better tool manufacturers will have multiple length sockets. Now, this is a deep, this is a shallow, this is called an intermediate. A shallow with the shortest extension is longer than the intermediate. So you actually have 4 combinations to get into any spot. So here you have 1, 2, move this to here, 3rd depth, and then 4th. So we're going to try this combination first. Okay, we're going to end up using an intermediate, but we're going to use a slimline ratchet separate from a standard swivel head ratchet because we need to get into a very tight spot. When you're in positions like this and things are kind of tight, don't get discouraged. You know, you're going to have times as a technician where your patience is going to be frustrated and tested. And you're not going to have the right tool all the time. You may have to borrow it from another technician in the shop you're working. You may have to go out and buy it. But what's nice about working on one brand of vehicle, you can tailor your tools to meet the needs of the vehicles you're working on. To work on every brand of car, you'll end up buying tons of tools that you might only use 1 or 2 times when that brand of vehicle comes in. So that's a decision you as a young technician will have to make. Now it's very hard to see what I'm working on here, but I have a fastener. The last one was a 12. And this one seems to be a 14 again. Now, it's not visible. I'm doing everything by feel. So that one fits. Now, one thing that I'll share with you on reassembly, a little trick that I learned from an old gentleman is when you're reassembling and you're in these really tight spots, like NFL football players use a tacky substance, the receivers on their gloves, you use a similar spray adhesive on your nitro gloves that allow you to have the ability to hold on to the fastener much better than without the adhesive. So just a little trick. As long as the fastener's clean, has no grease or oil on it, now if you're wondering what I'm doing, I loosen it up. There's a spot that the threads keep grabbing. So I'm able to turn it a half a turn with the ratchet. And then it gets loose. So now the next tool I want to introduce you to is a palm ratchet. For really tight spots where you can't get the fastener loose, put a palm ratchet on. It has a knurled outer edge and it works like a regular ratchet, only there's no handle. And you can only use this once you've broken it free, the fastener that is. Now there's no line of sight for me, so all you're seeing is my hand. The bolt is actually hidden underneath of the bracket. But what I'm doing is with the palm ratchet, or fingertip ratchet some people call them, I'm able to loosen the fastener enough to where it now will spin just with my fingertips. Okay. So now I'm going to use it here just to show it to you. Now because it has a knurled larger diameter, it gives you some leverage for turning the bolt. As long as your gloves are not covered in oil, you're good to use it without it slipping and sliding. Okay. So now, it took about 10 minutes, but our bracket is now off. And for young technicians, I urge you, position your bolts in the bracket the way they came out. Okay. Now, if you have a rubber band, put a rubber band around the bolt shafts. It'll hold everything in place. So now for the first time, we're starting to see the timing cover. Okay. Our next step is to remove the water pump pulley. And to do that, we're going to drop the engine down just a little bit. Now you got to be careful because other hoses are still attached to air conditioning and to power steering. And we don't want to rip a hose, so we just want to bring it down enough that we can reach it from the bottom. All right. So now I broke these free with a wrench before I removed the power steering, not the power steering, but the serpentine belt. Because I can get it low enough that I can reach it with an extension, I can take an air ratchet now and take all three of those fasteners off. So we'll get our 1/4 inch drive with our 10mm. We'll hang up our 3/8 again. So now with the bolts removed, we can take the power steering pulley off, which exposes more of our timing cover hardware. All right. We have another idler pulley here, and we have a tensioner pulley here. Once those are removed and the crank harmonic balancer is removed, we'll be able to take all our perimeter bolts off and slowly work our timing cover off of the engine. Okay, in this next step, we're going to set the engine on top dead center. So we're going to remove the number 1 spark plug. Now in this step, you can either use a 1/4-inch extension or a very long screwdriver. And what we're going to do is we're going to pass it down on top of the head of the piston. So again, it doesn't matter what you're using, but what we're going to do is we're going to watch the movement as we turn the crankshaft. Now, this engine turns in a clockwise direction. So we're going to turn our crankshaft clockwise. Never reverse rotate an engine. You can cause it to jump time, especially if you have a worn timing belt. So as we turn this crankshaft, we see the extension descend to bottom dead center, and we're coming up on our top dead center stroke. Now we turn very slowly and we watch when the extension comes to a rest at the top. Now, looking at this, we have to understand if we're at top dead center about to have an intake stroke, or if we're at top dead center in a compression stroke. So what we're looking at here is our exhaust valves just closed and our intake valves are about to open. So I'm going to go through the cycle. If we watch as the piston descends, our intake valves are opening, so we're drawing air into the cylinder. We see our exhaust lobe coming up, so our exhaust valve is closed. And now as the piston starts to come up, the intake lobe is closing, and now we're in our compression stroke. And this is where we want to be, because this is top dead center. This is where the cylinder would fire. So I want to very slowly at which point my extension has stopped moving. There's about a 10-degree window as the journal on the crankshaft comes around and then starts its travel back down. And in those 10 degrees is when the piston's at top dead center. Now, that's not for all engines. Some could have a longer duration. I'm just giving you an example of the sweep of the crankshaft journal. So now at this point, we can go ahead and remove our harmonic balancer. We're gonna break it free. Now, Kias are very easy in one respect. Their harmonic balancer is not pressed onto the snout of the crank. So if we reach in here and just give it a little wiggle, it will come out. Just set that off to the side. So now we're at a point where we can start to remove all of our fasteners off of our timing cover. We have our timing cover, harmonic balancer, removed. Our crankshaft harmonic balancer, I misspoke. We have all of our idler pulleys removed, our tensioner removed, and our water pump pulley removed. So now we have the ability to start removing our timing cover. All right. Now, I strongly urge you to index all of your bolts on a piece of cardboard, because many of these bolts will be different lengths, although the threads will be the same size. So please, we're going to take a break, and I'm going to go get a piece of cardboard and a marker, and we're going to draw out the timing cover, and we're going to put the bolts in sequence around it on the cardboard so that we do not make a mistake, which is critical on an engine you've never taken apart before. Okay. Off camera, I went ahead and drew a close facsimile of the timing cover. Now, this hole and this hole are open with no bolts in it as of right now, because they were two holes that the engine mount went through. So I don't punch a hole in the cardboard, I just draw a line across it, so that lets me know no bolt goes there. So now, as the bolts come out of the timing cover, push them through the cardboard. Now there's an additional bolt I didn't illustrate here and here. So if you have that happen, just add holes to your pattern in the location they belong. Okay, at this time we have all the upper bolts off. We're going to lower the engine a little bit until it puts a little strain on the AC line. And then we're going to stop. And we're going to move down below. blends in with the dirt. Now, we have a few in the oil pan here. So we're going to come in below the frame. Well, to get that one 10mm bolt out, we have to remove this bracket for the AC. So we're going to take a pause while I go ahead and get that off of there so we can get the last 10mm bolt out. All right, as you can see, I've removed the bolts, the 2 long bolts on the AC compressor and the 4 12mm bolts. All right, the head are 12, but the threads are 8x125 pitch. That gives us access to that last 10mm on the corner of the timing cover. So we're going to go ahead and get that next. All right, so now we can actually get on that. Okay. All right, so that was the last of the timing cover bolts. I want to make a hole for that. And on the same paper, I'm going to go ahead and make 4 holes for the AC bracket bolts. All right, this bolt actually is the 4th one, okay? So now, if we take a quick look, we've indexed all of our bolts for our timing cover, so we can't make any mistakes putting it back together. Okay, in this next step, we're going to use a series of long, different length flat screwdrivers, a sharp box cutter. All right, this is called a wallpaper tool actually. It has a very thin, sharp blade. All right, and some plastic wedges. So the timing cover is held on with sealant and dowel pins. So we want to start by separating the halves and position a screwdriver, and then we want to carefully, without forcing anything, work down the timing cover. Now what I'm doing is I'm just holding pressure. And I'm giving the sealant time to crack and tear. Even though I'm using a large pry bar, I'm just keeping a light, steady pressure. Now, my problem area is right in here, where you can see that my exhaust side of my cover is separating easily, all the way down to the water pump. All right, I don't know if you guys can see that, but that's a dowel pin, and you can see it's rusted. All right, so that's my problem. I gotta somehow get some lubricant in there and wiggle and work that back and forth until I get that dowel pin to free up. Okay, so we're gonna try to very gingerly. All right, now you heard that release, and I don't know if you can see, I'm gonna point to it. The dowel remained in the block and the cover let go. The penetrating oil had time. I had paused the video and let it soak for a couple minutes, and then I put, just like I'm splitting a log, I put the tip of my screwdriver in here and worked it down. So again, I'm going to take my large pry bar and do the wiggle thing. Okay, so now I have it off of the dowel. I continue to look. I have a dowel here. Now, here's where the knives come into play. Let's bring them down. And between my oil pan and my timing cover, I want to get the blade of a knife and work it through the sealant. All right. So now my dowel on the other side is holding us up. So I want to get the tip of this large screwdriver in here. Okay. All right. I'm going to go get a center punch.